Good evening, and welcome to tonight's budget hearing. This is will be followed directly after with the annual meeting. We'll go over the budget hearing though. To get started, thank you for taking the time to come out and tonight and learn about the budget that we have to present to the public here tonight. I'm going to start out just going over what we're going to cover here in this presentation. We'll go over the budget timeline, how we develop the budget as an administrative and school board team. We'll go over Wisconsin school funding formula and some basics around that, and how enrollment is projected to look in the future going forward here. We'll also take a quick look at our revenue budget, our expenditure budgets, and the fund balance, where that's going to end for the year. We'll then take a look at our tax levy and the mill rate associated with that, and then next steps to finalizing the budget, which occur this fall. September is one of the first things that have to happen yet with our enrollment count, and then we're looking for some numbers from the state that come in October. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So we'll go through the timeline to start with here. In December, right after we get done setting the budget for the last year, or for the year we just got through, we get started right away working on the next year's budget. And from December of 19 through April of 20, we were working on developing our preliminary budget. And that starts out with a budget forecast, looking out what the next 3 to 5 years look like, focusing mostly on those first 3 years, and then developing budget parameters from there. On March 18th, we had a Finance Committee meeting to review the preliminary budget, and then on April 8th, we brought that budget to the full board for action, and that's the budget that you're going to be seeing here tonight. The board approved that to move forward to the annual meeting. It's here for you, the electorate, to observe it, take a look at it, review it, and vote on it. Vote on the budget going forward and the tax levy for the year. Between May and October, we've continued to monitor the budget changes and things that might be happening at the state level. We know with the COVID-19 situation, we've been prepared and kind of waiting for what the state might do in terms of offering resources or not offering resources to the schools. We haven't heard anything other than we know the legislature is not interested in getting back together until possibly after the election, which means our budget will already be set, the tax levy will be set for the year. So any budget adjustment would be after the fact for school districts that we would have to either go into our fund balance or try to reserve expenditures as we get through the year, if something were to happen after we set this final budget in October. Tonight we're here at the annual meeting, and then like I was getting at, the late October and early November is when we finalize our budget and tax levy. I'm going to start with a basic look at the school funding formula. I'm not sure how this is going to show up there. Okay, you are able to kind of read those numbers up there. But basic funding formula looks like this. It starts out with the revenue limit formula. So the revenue limit determines how much revenue a school is allowed to operate with in the upcoming school year. So our revenue limit for the upcoming year is about $21.5 million to operate with. Once you have that number, you have some other revenues that fall outside of that, but you'll see in the next slide, it's not much. We have to align our expenditures to that number. We take a look at what do we predict our state equalization aid might be. So what is the state going to fund of that revenue limit? And we subtract that out. And the remainder, that equals what we would levy for a tax. So really the revenue limit caps what we're allowed to tax indirectly. Revenue limit minus state aid equals the tax levy, is the most basic way to look at the formula. So our numbers are there. Those are Arrowhead's estimated numbers for the upcoming 2021 budget year. We're looking at $21.5 million in revenue limit authority. We think we'll get about $4 million in equalization aid. There's a couple other aids there, computer aid and personal property aid. That is the aid for businesses that are exempt from their computer equipment or their personal property. the state pays that portion of the taxes that would have been collected on that equipment and pays it in that form of an aid. So those are the three aids that go into the aid and get subtracted off the revenue limit, and the remaining balance is what goes onto the tax levy. So why is the revenue limit so important? It determines our funding for the year. It determines where we have to get our expenditures in line with for the upcoming year. And if we don't do that, we're going to be short, and we're going to be dipping into fund balance, which is not something we can sustain over time to pay for recurring expenditures through the fund balance. You'll run out real quick. So if you take a look at this bar going across the top there, that's our total revenue limit, and I'm sorry, that's our total revenues. The portion up to the gray is what's limited by the revenue limit formula. So about 88% of our revenues fall within this calculation. The other 12% comes through per pupil categorical aid, and then some other operating revenues that we get, like open enrollment and some student fee income and gate receipts and things like that. The revenue limit is determined by taking your membership or student count, multiplying it by what the state has allowed you as a maximum amount per member or per student, and that's what determines how much revenue you have to work with. So it's student count times the maximum amount per student equals total revenue limit to work with.
What year is this for, this slide?
I'm sorry?
What year is this slide representing?
This is from 1920, the 88%. So this is actual figures from the 2019-20 school year. The previous slide was 2021, but I'm just showing on a typical year, about 88% is capped by the revenues, by the revenue limit formula. So you can see membership or student count is a real important number. And so here's our history and projection of student count. We are expecting to go down another 30 students going into the next year. That's an estimated number in the yellow line there at 2076 or 2,076 students. We'll get that number on the third Friday count in September. If you take a look at our history, here's just another look at those same numbers, only in a bar chart. And you can kind of see, if you drew a trend line there, it'd be a small decline over the last 10 years or so here. So we're projecting for next year a decrease of 1.4% in the student count. Here's another look, just going from 16-17 and then predicting out 5 years into the future. So you can see that decline continues going forward. After the 1.4% loss in this upcoming year, we're looking at almost a 1% loss the following year, and then a 1.65% decrease, and a 2.5%, and so on down the line. Now, the further we get out in this projection, the less reliable those numbers are, but that's kind of the trend that we're looking at. And when you think to revenue limit is driven off of that student count, that means our total revenues available will likely go down with that student count. And we don't necessarily have enough teachers to, if we lose 10 students or 30 students even, it doesn't mean they're all in one class and that we can reduce one staff member for those 30 students. But those 30 students generate about $10,000 per student, which is $300 grand. And if, it's hard, even one staff member wouldn't cost $300,000. So the loss of 30 students is pretty dramatic. And then we have to find other places to make the reductions to make the expenditures and revenues line up. So this is just another trend line of the actual revenue limit membership. So what this is, the numbers are a little different here, and all it's doing is looking at resident student count on a 3-year average basis. So it's taking all the kids that sit in our seats, subtracting out the open enrollment kids that come from other districts, the ones that come to us from other districts, and then it adds back in the students that live in our district but might attend elsewhere. Now we have a lot more students that come into our district from other districts than we have going out through open enrollment. But this is the 3-year average, and that's why they call it a membership number, because it's true resident students that you're calculating your revenue limit off of, not the kids that are sitting in your seats necessarily. Because generally, we have more students sitting in our seats than we have revenue limit authority for, but we get an open enrollment revenue from other districts to pay for those students coming in and sitting in our seats. And we don't create classes with those extra kids. We fill classes up with the extra classes since we already have the teacher in place. So it's a nice revenue stream for us to help offset our budget. So this is a look at the maximum revenue per member. So that previous slide showed the 2008 full-time equivalent students that we're predicting for next year. If we multiply 2008 by the $10,447 per student, that will generate our maximum allowable revenue limit for the year that we have to balance our budget to. So again, it's membership times revenue per member equals your revenue limit. This is a look at where Arrowhead sits in the revenue limit formula compared to the other districts across Waukesha County. There's a lot of numbers here, but if we look at the first column, we're looking at which district it is. The next column with the first smaller numbers there is how much revenue each of those districts are allowed through the revenue limit formula per student or per member. If you multiply that per student amount, for Arrowhead it's $10,230. If you multiply that by our 2008 membership number, you get $20.5 million. If you took Elmbrook's number of $11,844 and multiplied it by that same number of students that we have here at Arrowhead, the 2008, in the same year, for the same number of students, they would be able to raise $23.7 million compared to our $20.5 million. That's the difference in the revenue limit formula, and it goes back to the year it went into place. In 1993, wherever your district was spending is where you were capped at for the year going forward. And so a high spending district was able to retain that dollar per student going forward. A low conservative spending district like Arrowhead had a much lower starting point, and everyone increased at the same amount going forward for until 2009-10. Well, actually, we still go up the same amount each year. It's just that it was capped at the consumer price index for those first few years up until 2009-10, and then the numbers we didn't get consumer price index. But that's a large difference. If you look at the annual difference just between the top district in the state in terms of how they're funded, they get $3.2 million more than we have to operate with each year on the same student count. If you multiply that by 5 years, that's a lot of dollars. That's $16 million that they have to work with. So those are some of the reasons we're not able to fund some of the facility infrastructure projects that we'd like to be able to fund and make sure our facilities stay in place. So it's difficult to balance these budgets each year when you have that kind of an inequity going right in your own county with the level of funding. So let's move a little bit away from revenue limit and on to state aid. Yes?
Is there any talk at the state level about doing something about that figure that was thrown back in 93 to make this more equitable?
There's been talk about it, but no will to do anything about it. So there's been 3 in my career of 16 years or so, 16, 17 years, there's been 3 funding study groups that have come up with different ideas, and none of them have been implemented. The latest one was called the Blue Ribbon Commission. It was about a year or 2 ago that worked on this, and some pieces, this inequity came up, but nobody knows. There's going to be winners and losers, and the people that are getting elected are not willing to take those winners and losers and find an equitable way. It just seems to make sense that you might, maybe give the lower ones an increase until they catch up, or a larger increase compared to the higher ones until they catch up to make things equitable, especially on a countywide basis. Across the state, some things up in the northern part might be less expensive than down here in southeast Wisconsin. But within your own county, you'd think that would be more closely aligned. That's a good question. Revenue limit versus state aid. So revenue limit, again, is the size of the pie that we have to work with. State aid is how much of that pie is the state going to fund for you. What's left, as I said, was the property tax. So the main general aid program is equalization aid. Here's again a look at that basic funding formula. Revenue limit minus the aids equals the property tax. So each district gets a different amount of funding. Well, let me back up. The revenue limit we saw was different district by district, and that's the amount of revenue you have to work with, so you really have to balance your expenditures to that number. Now, of that number, how much will the state pay and how much will the local taxpayer pay? That depends on the wealth of your district, and it's measured by property value divided by your membership count, your student count. So property value per student. And our district looks a lot like the pie on the left, the more red pie. About 82% local taxes pay for fund our revenue limit, and about 18% comes from the state. Now in a property poor district, less property value per student, you might range from 89%, 95% state funded, and the other portion local property tax. So it's all measured. Again, it doesn't change the size of the pie that we have to work with. That was determined by the revenue limit calculation. It just changes of the size of the pie, who's paying for what portion of it. And that's the state aid formula. So when they say they're putting money into the state aid formula, it doesn't mean schools are getting more money to work with. It means it's going to lower property taxes. If they take money out of the state aid formula, it means property taxes are going to go up because they're giving less funding to the schools, which means more funding coming from the property taxpayer. Here's a look at our state aid history going back to 2018-19 and then predicting forward. So we're in the 2021 school year. We're predicting, and this is pretty real, it's likely going to happen, that we're going to lose about $700,000 in state funding. So that'll be a shift from the state over to the local property taxpayer through the loss of state aid. The next year, we think right now it'll go up, but there's a lot of assumptions in that number because the state hasn't determined what the state budget looks like for the next two fiscal years. So this is the last year we have a hard number in state law to build off of. And now actually, as I think this through, with the COVID-19 impact, this number is likely going to come way down, but there's nothing to predict it on. So it's really a best guess at this point. So this is the maximum amount any district can lose in 1 year, and that's 15%. And we're likely going to see that in the 2021 school year. We'll get that number certified in October. That's when we'll find out what that really is going to be. But all the calculations and all the estimates lean in this direction. It's a pretty real number. So now we're looking at a bar chart of various years, beginning in 14-15 all the way to 2021, the upcoming fiscal year here. And you can see this is the total revenue limit authority available to Arrowhead. And back in 14-15, we had the authority for $21.9 million. That went up slightly for a few years, and now we're right back down to that $21.5 million. So you can see our revenues have been pretty steady over the last few years in terms of revenue limit authority. Not a lot of lift in that. Now, on the expenditure side, you know health insurance goes up. You know salaries, our staff members want some increases. You know the cost of electricity and fuel and those things, you all have to be adjusted. The cost of insurance. Those fixed costs continue to go up while our revenues stay pretty solid across the way. So it's a balancing act and a lot of work to try to get these two numbers to align. Here's a look at our revenues over the last 3 years, 2 years, and then going into next year. We're aligned at about $25.8 million. The top line is the property tax. So I'm just pulling out some of the major revenues that we operate off of. The open enrollment is the second line down. That's a major source of revenue. That's where those students from other districts choose to come to Arrowhead, and we get some funding that goes along with that. The general state aid, you can see we've been right around 4.6, 4.7 million, and next year we're predicting to be closer to around 4 million. And then we get the per pupil categorical aid in blue there. That's a newer aid to school districts. It's a pretty important aid, but that's the lever that I'm afraid the legislature could change after we've already adopted our budget and built our plan for the year. If they're going to change any number after we set the tax levy, that would be the number they could go after and change. So if there's anything to be nervous about, that would be the one that I would be nervous about after the November election, if they were going to make an adjustment to this year. The next 2 years are what are pretty worrisome, which are going to be determined on the next state budget plan that's developed, next biennial budget. So where does our revenue come from? I kind of alluded to it earlier. Most of it local sources. This is total revenues between Fund 10 and Fund 41, which both fall within the revenue limit. And about 70% come from the local taxpayer and local fees and gate receipts and things like that, but generally the taxpayer. State sources make up about 23%. If you think we get much federal funding, this shows that we don't. So we get some small federal grants to supplement some programs, but not a lot more than that. And then other sources are things like we get some credit card rebate and some interest income and some other small revenues that go into that other sources there. Insurance dividends off our worker comp premium if we have a good year the year prior. So that's a look at the expenditures. I'm going to take a quick look at the, I'm sorry, that was a look at the revenues. It's a quick look at the expenditures now. Our total expenditures we balanced the budget. We're at 25.8 million is what our planned expenditures are for the upcoming year. We had to make some reductions. We had to reduce what we were able to put into some of the facility infrastructure projects that we would have liked to fund. We had to make some adjustments to our health insurance to align this in order to get this expenditure budget down into alignment with the revenues that are allowed by the state. So the majority of our expenditures comes through salary and benefits. We're a people business. It takes a lot of people to teach a lot of kids. And so $18 million is what we're projecting for our salary and benefits. And then I mentioned that we do have some of our resident students that live in Arrowhead that attend some other districts. And there's about a $500,000 expenditure related to those going out. Remember on the other slide I showed about 1.6 million coming in. So we're ahead of the game, which is a good place to be. There's districts on the flip side of that. You don't want to be there. That's a major expenditure to your budget. Unfortunately, we're on the winning end of that. You can see our transfer to Fund 27. So Fund 27 is special education expenditures. The state funds about 26% of, it used to be 24.5% of the total expenditures for our special education students. At one time there was talk that they would fully fund that. They haven't even ever come close to that. They even talked about maybe 60% in the last budget discussion about it. But again, they're not even coming close to it. They're funding about 26% going into the next year. So the general fund has to pick up the difference in revenue and expenditures in that fund, and that's about 1.7 million for next year. So I'm looking at this transfer to Fund 27 or special education line. This is just a look at some of the things we've done with health insurance over the years. It's a 10-year look. In the most recent year, we made a $176,000 reduction in what would have been the premium cost by making a plan design change, adding co-insurance to the employees. So it's putting some more dollars on the employees back, but we had to do that in order to get our expenditures in line with the revenues. This next slide is just showing a comparison from a 10-year look. Looking back 10 years ago, what did things look like compared to today? And you can see we have had to scale back on our expenditure. So as a percent of the budget, the personnel is down from almost 74% to 69%. The continuing budget is up a little bit. That's supplies and equipment to operate the district each year. Special education is right about that 6.5%. Supplemental are the things that we fund, like new computer systems or The B&G supplemental would be for like a roofing project or window project or upgrades on some doors. And capital expansion fund is also used for those facility type of things. So the majority of our budget, as the previous slide shows, is on personnel. This is a look at all of the union high school districts across the state of Wisconsin, and where does Arrowhead fall? So this is a comparison. There's only 10 union high school districts in the state of Wisconsin, and we're third from the bottom in cost per student to provide education. And I would imagine we're probably, if not the top, but we are at the top in terms of student achievement results. So the value that our residents get in this district is really strong. So when you put those revenues up right next to the expenditures, revenues on top, expenditures on the bottom, you see the difference in budgets from the 18-19 year. We actually added almost $500,000 to the fund balance that year. This year's budget, we had planned for a $1.6 million decrease to the fund balance, and we made a budget adjustment in April and added another $500,000 to try to get some projects done while the kids were not in the buildings. So that number is actually $2.1 million is what our planned reduction to fund balance in 1920 would be. I don't think we're going to do that. I think we're going to actually shift some of those expenditures into the next year because we didn't have time to get some of those projects that we had planned to get done. But we do have a balanced budget planned for the upcoming 2021 school year. And the fund balance sitting at about 31%. I'm going to talk a little bit about fund balance coming up in another slide here. I'm going to give you another look at this slide just with it in a bar chart form. So you can see in 18-19 we were fairly balanced. We actually added a little bit to fund balance in the blue. In 19-20, where the purple is exceeding, the expenditures are exceeding the revenues. And then in 2021 we have a balanced budget. So we added a little fund balance, take away a little fund balance, and then we're going to stay right where we are with the balanced budget. So let's talk a little bit about fund balance. There's some perceptions out there that fund balance is just a slush fund or a savings account, but it's more than that. This is a measurement in time. When I showed that fund balance number being at 31%, that's on June 30th, the end of the fiscal year. We don't get our property tax receipts until January 15th, and by about the end of December, that last payroll in December and the first payroll in January, that $8.2 million is down to about zero, or real close to it. This last year we were able to get away with a line of credit that we took out, a $1.5 million line of credit, and we were monitoring it daily to see if we were going to have to tap into it, and we didn't have to tap into it. So we saved on some short-term borrowing. Many districts go out and borrow for 12 months, that $1.5 million, pay interest on it, earn a little bit of interest on it, but it's a cost. We avoided that this year because our fund balance is strong enough to get by with a line of credit that you can, if we were going to need something, we were going to need something for maybe a 2-week period, and then we would have reduced our interest cost significantly by doing that and not borrowing for the full year. So fund balance really helps your cash flow, and we need the cash flow in those low months as we get to early January and late December until those tax receipts come in, because we're so heavily funded by local taxpayer dollars and less by state dollars. Our fund balance shows our financial stability. We have a AA1 rating, which is an excellent rating. There's only 10 districts, I think, that are above that in the state of Wisconsin, and those are large districts with super large tax bases. I'm sorry, there's 14, it looks like, that have a better rating than us. But that's an excellent rating for a district our size. And it goes by, they make that rating based on what your fund balance looks like. Do you balance your budget each year? Have you paid down your debt service? Do you have a lot of debt sitting out there? And we don't have, well, we're down to zero debt on our long-term debt, and we have 5 years left on another small loan out there in terms of debt. So this rating will definitely stay where it is at, the way we've been operating the last couple of years. So referring back to that basic funding formula again, revenue limit minus state aid equals property tax. We're going to get into the property tax now and take a look from year over year, the last a 3-year look here. And in the upcoming year, we're looking at a 5.2% decrease in the total levy. The majority of that is coming right here from this debt service line. As I said, we paid off our last debt payment on the long-term debt from 1999, I believe. That last payment was made in March of 2020. Oops. And so there's a $1.7 million decrease in the total levy because we're not levying for that debt. Now that's what the referendum that's coming up on the November ballot is looking to fill. We have some significant infrastructure issues to deal with. We have leaking roofs. We have technology that's outdated and no longer supported from a basic infrastructure standpoint. We have some water drainage issues across the district. And you can see from our revenue limit per member compared to the rest of Waukesha County, we don't have the funding to be able to take care of some of those things. So the idea is that we would ask that we backfill this debt service payment that's no longer there with a referendum to fund those infrastructure projects. But as it sits today, this is what we would expect without a referendum, a decrease to the overall tax levy. Even if we were to add the 1.7 million in there, it'd be a slight increase, but that increase, remember, came from the loss in the state funding. It wasn't because we increased our revenues to work with. It was because we lost state funding, which means local taxpayer funding goes up. Here's a look at the mill rate then. So how do we get to the mill rate? We take that total levy, that's $17.3 million, and divide it by the total value, equalized value of the school district. We're predicting that equalized value to be $6.5 billion worth of property value in the Arrowhead School District. That's a 2.5% increase over last year. Now, I just got some numbers in yesterday that took the May certified values, and we can run that through a formula and see that's a pretty good predictor what your October number is going to look like. We won't get this final number until October, but that prediction shows that we're going to see a 6% increase. We took a super conservative approach at 2.5% here. When we see that 6.5% increase, or somewhere darn close to it, this levy rate is not going to be 266. It's going to be much lower than that. So when you factor that in, and if you were to put that referendum amount in the levy, you're still likely going to see a mill rate decrease with a 6% increase in property value, because it's taking the total levy, dividing by a larger number, and so your tax rate is coming down. I ran some numbers on that, and I think they're coming up here. So here's the basic equation for how to get to the mill rate or the tax rate. You take your total levy, divide it by your equalized property value of the full district, multiply by 1,000, and you get to the 266 number. This is what our mill rate has looked like the last 3 years. $3.07 in 18-19, $2.88 this past year, and we're predicting $2.66, which we know now after those May property values came through that number is going to be significantly lower than that with a 6% increase in property value. Here's a look at a home. Back in 2011, the home valued at $264,000, and I just took the equalized value increase over the past 10 years and averaged it out. It averaged out to be 1.16% per year increase. So I took that home and increased it by 1.16% for the last 10 years, and it brings the home value up to $305,000. So that same home, with some increase in value, you can see what the total taxes on that home from Arrowhead would be over the years. Next year we're predicting a decrease here. Even if we were to backfill that with the 1.7 million through an operating referendum in November, it's going to sit somewhere in here, maybe slightly above this 800. And now with the equalized value coming in, it's probably going to be right around where it was last year, or maybe even a little less, even with that revenue limit authority if it's allowed by the November referendum. Here's a look at our mill rates over time, just strictly the mill rate. Since 10-11, we were at 355. It's been dropping quite a bit in these last few years here. We're predicting a 266, which now again, as I saw yesterday coming through an email, that prediction is going to be lower. So these last two lines are both looking at 2021. This one right here is with a referendum in there, just for a visual. You look across here, not much higher and actually much lower than where we had been in history, but a little bit higher than where we would be if we didn't have it. But again, it's because we dropped off that debt payment. We don't have it anymore. And if we could backfill it to take care of some of our leaking roofs and things, that would be really helpful. This next slide is looking at the mill rates across all of the Union High School districts. Again, there's 10 of them across the state. We're the second from the lowest in terms of mill rate. So again, value, Arrowhead residents are getting a high value for the student achievement results that are coming out of this district for the low mill rate is pretty impressive. And I've only been here a year, so I can say that all the work done before me was pretty impressive. So that leads us to the next steps. We're working off the 1921 biennial state budget. We hope that won't change, and we don't think it will before we certify our levy here in November. But the next three things we need is a September count, the actual state aid that'll get certified in October, and then the actual certified property values. Once we have those three numbers, we're able to finalize the budget, finalize the tax levy, and then certify those levies to the municipalities. And that's which would show up on the tax bills that go out in December. And that's all I have. Any questions? Yes.
With the massive loss in state tax revenue as a result of business shutdown, state closing, and so on, have you heard any discussion about schools taking the shorts this fall?
Absolutely. We've been talking about it all spring long, and we thought there would be an adjustment for the current year, for the 2021 school year here. But again, as I said, the legislature is not interested in getting back together until after the election. So we'll already have certified our levy and finalized our budget before that can happen. So I think about the only lever that they could still pull while we're into the fiscal year would be that per pupil aid number, because levy's already set, so we can't pull back on state aid. Those things are already going to be set in place. But the per pupil aid they could, which means we would have less revenue than we were expecting if they were to pull back on it, which means we'd be dipping on the fund balance or having to find some expenditures when the school year's already well on its way. We're halfway through the year by then, before any decisions will likely be made on that. So hopefully that won't happen. The years to look at, notice this biennial budget ends in 21 here. So the next biennial budget is 21 through 23. That's the one that's going to be tough to work with. So our next 2 fiscal years ahead of us, and probably even another couple before we get out of this lack of revenue mess from COVID, are going to be difficult. Yes?
How much money is in the proposed budget for building and grounds expenditures in 2021?
We've got, just on the facility project side, there's about $500,000 worth of projects in there. There's some that's going to carry over from last year that didn't get done into this year, but what we've got planned for the upcoming year is about $500,000 worth. Now that's excluding utilities and electrical bills and gas. That's just projects.
So we go from $1.9 million to 500,000
Right.
between the 2 years. And the total expenditures, the revenue limit is going up.
No,
Where's the money going?
revenue limit's going down.
The revenue limit, you said, was 21,400,000
Mm-hmm.
going to 21,500,000. That's an
Okay.
increase.
Yep.
Okay.
Right, because we had a per pupil
It's not much,
increase
but
amount.
it's an
Yep.
increase.
Right.
So where is the loss of ability to self-fund building and grounds type expenditures at a $2 million level, as it has been by the exhibit I saw on the board website.
Right.
2 million or $1.9 million
Yep.
and change, $1.9 million and change, 18, 19, 19, 20. Now it goes to $500,000,
Right.
and we say, oh, we can't afford anything.
Right. But if you look up here,
Okay, could you,
in the middle column there,
yeah?
that $1.6 million is a use of fund balance. We can't afford to do that on an annual basis. If we do, we'll be borrowing for a full year just to meet cash flow and to pay our payroll bills in December and early
Okay,
January.
but what about the 2 million the year before, when there was a surplus of 450? So there's an increase in the non-capital type expenditures to the tune of $1 million, $1.5 million, both in 19 and 20, and then proposed again for 2021. I don't see the austerity in that area, in that other area.
Well, the difference is we pulled back on projects so we don't dip into our fund balance going forward. This year, when we actually were planning to use fund balance in that year, some of the projects got shifted forward into the upcoming year. The revenues don't go up enough to match the expenditure increases.
Okay.
We pulled back, we made some health insurance adjustments. Salary increases stay with CPI.
So I hear what you're saying, but the way that the board is choosing to spend our revenue limit, I think it's shifted to now package the shortfall as needing a referendum. I'm just commenting that way. Okay. I have another question.
Yeah. And the debt has dropped off. to be
Yeah,
able
I
to-
agree.
Yeah,
And that's not in the tax levy for
correct.
2021. So what specific actions did the board take as classes were not held on campus for the last two and a half months of the school year? I think about categories like food services, bus transportation, the attendance office. What actions were taken to conserve on that budgeted amount of money?
Mhm.
Because things were spent for sure.
Right. We furloughed several positions that were not needed because kids were not in school.
29.
29 positions.
Part-time employees, were any full-time
A
employees?
couple
for-
were full-time, most were part-time.
Excuse me?
A couple people were more full-time, but most of those 29 were part-time employees.
Okay, I thought it was described as all part-time in the school board minutes.
We have a busing contract that was in place.
Yeah.
In order to keep our busing company ready for action in this year,
Yeah,
the contract by contract language says that we'll pay them
whether they run buses or not.
70%. So we reduced our
Okay.
cost by 30% for those months that we didn't run buses. We negotiated with them to get another 5% knocked off of that if that were to happen going into the next year again.
Okay.
So that's another area we reduced. The food service you mentioned, we laid off all of that help. And so we were providing meals, but those were all federally funded. So the district wasn't paying for any of those meals. That we're getting federal reimbursement for those meals that were provided after March.
So in the
18.
budget fund category that says food service, there was about a $30,000 reduction from prior year
Mhm.
and about a $30,000 increase going into the future year.
Mhm.
So that's all part-time staffers?
Well, it's a contracted service, so we contract the food service out. We have one staff member that is our employee, and the rest is a contract that we run through Chartwell's.
Okay, for which we didn't get any savings.
Well, there was some savings last year. That food service budget, as long as that stays in the black, we're not dipping into our general operating budget or tax dollars for it. It's self-funded. It's a self-funded business, and it stays in there. But if it loses money, then we would have to fund it through the general operating fund. And so we're just looking for that to stay in
No
the
support
black.
on that in the tax levy.
Correct. And there hasn't been in many, many years in this district. Some districts do have to fund a portion of it through their tax levy because they're losing money on their food service program. We haven't been losing money.
So was there any savings in the attendance office?
Yes, well, those are some of the positions that were furloughed.
Okay.
Right, the 2 attendance secretaries are what we would consider full-time, even though general public thinks of full-time as 8 hours a day. I believe they're 6.5 hours a day,
Okay.
but that counts as full-time.
All right.
So we saved money, but I would also add, we increased expenses in certain areas. For instance, just to supply technology and some hotspots for students that did not have internet or adequate internet at home, it was at least $20,000 just for hotspots for students. So where there were some savings during a school shutdown, school was still happening. Virtual instruction was happening every day, day in and day out, and there were some costs to that that we weren't anticipating.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, has there been, and I gotta believe there has been over the years, a cost projection as to all the expenditures that you said need to be done? The leaky roofs, the HVAC improvements, so on and so forth. Is there a total cost that was derived as to what that would be, what that would entail to make all these repairs and fixes that need to be done?
Yes, that probably goes back to the last referendum that failed. Actually, it was about 30, what was the number, 34 million, 36 million?
Right,
Is that
so the 2016, November 2016 referendum, before that, there was a very thorough study done of what our needs were, but also what our wants are. And so that came to about $70 million. Some of that was needs, much of that was needs, and I would contend that some of that were desires. Like, for instance, this theater you're sitting in, it only seats 438 people. Our school district has 2,100 students. Even a class, a graduating class at Arrowhead is more than 500, average about 550 students. So one of the, I would say, in 2016 was, let's expand this theater so we can fit more than 400 people. Our class sizes are 550 to 600. So your question isn't easy to answer because the study showed we could spend $70 million and really get this place up to like exactly what we would want for our students. Instructional classroom renovations, better science labs. And the community rejected that referendum. The school board went back and administration school board went back and looked at, so what should we pull off? What were the wants? So the theater, for instance, came off. A new swimming pool came off. So we got it down to what we were considering a base plan, and that was the 2017 referendum, and that was about 34 or 36 million. That failed at the polls as well. And now we're coming back asking for 1.7 million for 5 years. So it's not a debt, there's no interest payments. As Jeff explained, it's just filling this gap for 5 years of what's already being paid. And that is not looking at improving classrooms, it's not looking at putting in any new structures or facilities. That's simply helping pay for the leaky roofs, the HVAC units that are 20 years old, our flooding problems on campus, our technology infrastructure, that the company can't even support it anymore because it's so old. So if we don't have 1.7 million to come in and offset these costs that keep going up, we will need to cut programs because we can't let roofs leak. We can't have roofs caving in, for instance. And so we'll have to start cutting programs or educational services for students because we've been trying to keep all of our educational offerings as strong as possible. That's what our community wants for our students. And now the costs keep increasing. Our roofs keep getting older, our HVAC units keep getting older, and despite spending an average of $1.4 million a year on those facilities, we are not keeping up.
So the idea is 1.7 million over the next 5 years is about 8.5 million. So about $8.5 million would take care of maintenance items that desperately need to be repaired.
Right, the leakiest of roofs.
Okay, now I have another question. We go back a couple years. I had proposed to the board to look into the Vittner property, to liquidate that and use those funds for maintenance items, those repair items. That property, according to the master plan that was developed a few years back, was to put this really nice, fancy, lacrosse fields and baseball diamonds and all this stuff over there that was going to cost like $8 million to do. Obviously, the budget cannot afford to develop anything like that, cannot afford to maintain anything like that over there. So again, with your projection of increased property values in Heartland, in the Heartland area, in the district, I propose again, with property values increasing, the value of that land, why will the board not look at selling that property, take the funds from that, and put that towards those maintenance
Right,
items?
and actually
That
the board,
that is a property there that could be worth a couple $1 million where you wouldn't have to borrow, you wouldn't have to do anything. You sell the property, you take the money and put it towards your repairs that are needed.
so the board actually has been looking at that. A couple of years ago, we had a land appraisal done, 2 or 3 years ago now, and the land was actually, according to that appraisal, worth less than what the board paid for it back in 2000. And the board was not willing to sell the land for a loss. That's not deemed responsible use of taxpayer money.
So in record property
And
value
so-
market, it's worth less than what they paid 19 years ago.
We have the appraisal. So at that time, they decided we're not going to sell that land. That was a couple to 3 years ago. Now we've had another appraisal done, and we're investigating beyond just that land appraisal amount, but we're also looking at comparable prices for land similar to that. And the range is extensive, from a value of $20,000 to $25,000 per acre up to $80,000 per acre, depending on where it's located, which city. So the board is actively pursuing finding out exactly what that land is worth. The board, I shouldn't say the board as a whole, but one board member has already been contacted by a contractor who would like to potentially purchase that land. And we're looking at selling. We are just not at the point where we're ready to do that because we want to find out the right value. We're also looking with an attorney, and then a real estate attorney has been proposed or recommended to us. So we're in that process. But I would say, even if and when that land is sold, let's say within the next year, it's not going to fund nearly what we need. That ongoing 1.7 million just takes care of the worst problems we have. The board has actually talked about, they have not voted yet to sell that land, and they have not voted on what that money would go toward. But the one idea that has come up with, if that land sells and it's for a profit, they're not going to sell for a loss, taking that chunk of money and putting that toward one project that's highly needed. So for instance, we have special ed areas in our 2 buildings where we educate special education students that are in really sad shape. That's inside the classroom. It's not about the HVAC units, it's not about the roofs. But that's one idea that has come up, is that was in the survey about the referendum back in 2016, that was a high need area and highly supported area by the community. The community voted, or not voted, but in the survey indicated, put your money towards special ed, put your money toward technology and manufacturing center. put your money toward infrastructure, roofing, HVAC units, the flooding on campus. So the board has gone back to look at what are those areas that would have been supported or considered supported by the community, and that's where we're trying to focus. So I think your recommendation from a couple years ago out looking at that land, I would contend the board is actively pursuing that. They're not going to sell for a loss, but now I think we're more comfortable and confident that it would not be for a loss. I don't want to share numbers because this is a public meeting and we want to have the best negotiating opportunities we can have, especially if we can have a couple of contractors interested in purchasing that land.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the fact that the board is pursuing it at least and
Yes.
looking at, getting the most money for the property and then that they're at least looking at, using it in a good way.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Should we shift to the regular
We
meeting?
should probably shift.